In 1602, Etienne Pasquet, who was a member of the Parliament of Paris, wrote a work called Le Catéchisme des Jesuits. My terrible French pronunciation. And he wrote the following about the Society of Jesus. He said, for pretending to uphold our Holy Father under better tokens than everybody else, and attributing to the Pope unprecedented authorities to the prejudice of bishops, he and his men, Ignatius and his men, obtained successively from one pope after another such privileges, indults, and grants to the prejudice of prelates, monasteries, and universities that by allowing them to live in the midst of us, you are erasing the true face of the Church, universal and Catholic. He goes on to say, I do not hesitate that the image of Lucifer, who wished to make himself equal to God, his creator, is represented in the person of the general of the Jesuits. So this man, who is the creature of the Pope, gives himself not only equal, but even greater power and authority over his own men than the Pope ever has over the universal Church. And in another part, the order being approved at Rome and Ignatius elected general on this basis of absolute power, he who had been nourished as a youth in a military milieu, without training based on literature, introduced into the family of the Jesuits a tyrannical government, desiring that all his wishes and those of his successors as general would be absolutely held as good, just, and valid. For although they have pretended since then to make a similar vow of obedience to the Holy See, and were on this basis authorized in Rome, it is the case that in all ways they give greater obedience to their superiors, such as their provincials and rectors. Even in their vow to go on a mission, their general has more power over them than the Pope does. Kind words about the Society of Jesus, harsh words about the Society of Jesus. Right from the beginning, in fact, from before the beginning, Jesuits have faced a lot of attacks, a lot of suspicious people. Ignatius was brought before the Inquisition because of what he was doing at the spiritual exercises in Spain, twice there and once in Rome. And the Jesuits have always been so strange and so liable to anger and confuse people in the church. And the question is, of course, why? And my answer is Jesuit discernment. Our way of discerning, our way of proceeding makes us suspect, because our way of proceeding has a way of challenging presumptions about what is essential. That is to say, we look to what is really the core, and we try not to get bogged down in the non-essential elements that get added to the core of things. We are obedient, but we are not obedient in the way of not questioning things. We are obedient in true fidelity, whereby we try to get into the mind of the one who is giving us the order. We try to really understand, not just to do what we are asked to do, but to understand it and therefore to do it with fidelity. And what's our process for doing that? Our process for doing that is discernment. And so our history has a lot to teach us about what this discernment looks like in practice. Discernment is something that we learn as Jesuits in the spiritual exercises. It's something that we learn, on the long retreat. And while the long retreat it can be very challenging, there's something very ideal about those circumstances. It's just us. We have a guide. We have the time, all these sorts of things. But discernment in practice, and particularly communal discernments, challenge us in different ways, because we have to do our discernments in the rough and tumble of the world, where things get messy. And in Jesuit history, our discernments have gotten very messy, and we have discerned very well in that messiness, and we have discerned in just almost unbelievably badly in that messiness. And that's what I want to explore, how discernment has worked in practice. Discernment, of course, we learn about the discernment of spirits from the spiritual exercises. And let's start by looking a little bit about what the exercises teach us about discernment, because I would argue that discernment is the heart of the spiritual exercises. It says at the very beginning of the exercises, the very first annotation, The first annotation is that by this name, spiritual exercises is understood every way of examining the conscience, of meditating, of contemplating, of praying vocally and mentally, and of other spiritual operations in accord with what will be said later. Because such as taking a walk, traveling on foot, and running are corporeal exercises, in the same manner, every way of preparing, disposing the spirit to quit itself of all disordered affections, and after having quit them, to seek and to find the divine will in the disposition of one's life for the health and salvation of the spirit, are called spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises in general, as Ignatius explains them here, even outside of the spiritual exercises, are about discerning what most leads us to God and discerning what are the things that are disordered in our life, that are not ordered toward God, but that lead us away from God. This is the heart of what the spiritual exercises teach us how to do, is how to pay attention to what are the essential things that lead us to God, and what are the non-essential things that don't help us, and what are the really bad things in our lives that actually are actively working against our pursuit of God, of God's will, of God's glory, of being with God for all eternity. The early Jesuits viewed their lives as lives in constant discernment, both individually and in common. And discernment, therefore, is at the heart of the phrase that the early Jesuits most often used to describe what it meant to be a Jesuit. A very strangely simple phrase, our way of proceeding, noster modus procedendi, or in Spanish, nuestro modo de proceder, or nuestro modo de vivir. Our way of living is also an alternative way of saying this. They use this phrase all over the place to as a shorthand among themselves, and occasionally even outside of their own context, to say, this is who we are, this is our way of proceeding. And they never really defined it. It was a reality that perhaps was obvious to all the early Jesuits, to the early companions, such that they didn't need to define it. But I think for our sake, it would be helpful if we could define it a little bit, because I think it points in a very important way that discernment is at the heart of Jesuit identity. It appears in the constitutions about 12 times. And the very first appearance comes in the General Examen, which I know you all remember very well, because you read it so thoroughly as novices or in your first probation. And it says, so you probably will know this reference before I even say it, just kidding. It says, Jesuits, quote, should always be ready in accord with our profession and way of proceeding to roam in every part of the world wherever it is enjoined to us by the Supreme Pontiff or our immediate successor. Our way of proceeding is linked in its first appearance in the General Examen to our ability to roam anywhere in the world, to our mission ability, to our mobility. It's also linked in the constitutions to reasons why a Jesuit might be dismissed. One reason for dismissal says, if one who has been admitted to probation is not able to conform his life to live under obedience and cannot lead himself according to the society's way of proceeding because he is unable or does not wish to overcome his own understanding and judgment, or on account of other impediments which arise either from nature or habit. Here, our way of proceeding is linked to obedience, and our way of proceeding is seen as the fundamental thing. If you can't do this, even if it's not your fault, even if it's you have a psychological or a physical reason you can't do it, if you can't be available to roam anywhere in the world, if you can't be available to do what you are called to do, to live in obedience, then you can't be a Jesuit. Our way of proceeding is essential to who we are. And what it really is freedom from the things that limit our availability and freedom for the things that we are called to do. And as you look at the examples as they come up in the letters of the early Jesuits, and particularly Ignatius's letters, you see that we are supposed to be, it is against our way of proceeding, for example, to accept stipends for masses, to pray, to agree to doing regular masses, to accept the care of souls, to pray for a long time. Wait a minute. We're not supposed to have regular masses, care for souls, or pray for a long while. What's really going on here? Ignatius wants us to be free to move wherever the greatest good is. Accepting the care of souls is a phrase that means becoming a parish priest. And at this time, becoming a parish priest would have meant being a parish priest at one particular parish for the rest of your life, most likely. The care of souls meant, in Ignatius's mind, you're saying, I'm going to stay here no matter what. And that's a problem, because Ignatius's mind on what our way of proceeding was, what was integral to our way of proceeding is, we always need to be ready to go where the greatest good is. And we always need to therefore assume that what we're doing right now might not be the greatest good. So we need to be ready to leave it. That's the same reason not to accept regular masses. We can't promise to say, a series of masses for someone, which was very common at the time, because we might not be able to do it. We also shouldn't be praying for hours and hours and hours a day. Why? Because prayer is bad? No, of course not. And of course, we all do pray for hours and hours a day when we're making the spiritual exercises. No, we're not supposed to pray for hours and hours a day, because we need to be free to help souls. The Jesuit way of proceeding is to be free to do the greatest good, helping people directly, not through intercessory prayer, but directly. And stipends, of course, are another way that limit our availability, because they link us into, well, first of all, they make our focus, they can make our focus on making money. And they link us into that way of thinking about sacraments. But what Ignatius is saying is, no, we need to be able to accept, to celebrate our sacraments and give our talks and do our work, regardless of whether we're paid. That's the most free we could be. So we shouldn't be demanding stipends for what we do, because we need to be free to help souls, to go wherever the need is greatest. That's the freedom. That's the freedom that we learn in the spiritual exercises in our formation, and it's the freedom that we embody in the way that we serve. So discernment, therefore, is key, because how do we determine what is the greatest good? We determine what is the greatest good by our prayer, by thinking, well, what is most ordered to God's glory in this moment? What's the best way that I can help souls? But let's take this out of the theoretical and into the practical and look at one of the founding discernments of the Society of Jesus. Let's look at the discernment of the first companions at Montmartre, the 7 companions at this point, who have all, except for Xavier, by 1534, August of 1534, when they gather at Montmartre, made the spiritual exercises. They've all made the spiritual exercises, and they have this great desire to be, except for Xavier has not made them, but he also has this desire to be, and he makes them later, obviously. They have this desire to be companions of Christ, living in simplicity and poverty and helping souls. They all have this desire, born of their experience on the exercises. And they decide that they're going to commit themselves to a particular plan. And the regular story that we know about this is the following. At Montmartre, they make a vow that they are going to go to Venice and then on to Jerusalem and spend their lives for the good of souls, to help souls, there. But if they can't get to Jerusalem, if they get stuck in Venice for over a year, or if they go to Jerusalem and they're not allowed to stay for the rest of their lives, they're going to present themselves to the Pope, and because they're going to offer themselves to do wherever the need is greatest in the church for the good of souls, at the pleasure at the service of the Roman Pontiff, who has this universal vision of the whole church. That's how Ignatius presents what happened in in his autobiography, in what we call his autobiography, the text that Luis Gonzalez de Camara wrote after his conversations with Ignatius. That's the story that we hear. But the interesting thing is that, in fact, we have other accounts of what happened that day, and they don't all exactly agree that that's what happened. Pierre Fabre, writing in his spiritual journal, says the following about that day. On the day of Our Lady in August of that same year, all of us who were already united in the same determination formed by the exercises, except Master Francis, who had not yet made them, though he was one with us in the enterprise, went to Our Lady of Montmartre near Paris. There each took a vow to set out for Jerusalem at the time decided, and on his return to place himself under obedience to the Roman pontiff. Each vowed, too, to make arrangements for leaving his parents and nets, retaining only provision for the journey. There were present at this first meeting Inigo, Master Francis, myself, Master Bobadilla, Master Lainez, Master Salmeron, and Master Simao. Did you notice the difference? Fabre doesn't say they're going to come back and place themselves at the disposal of the Roman pontiff if they can't stay in Jerusalem. He says they're going to place themselves under obedience to the Roman pontiff when they come back. Fabre thinks of the trip to Jerusalem as a pilgrimage, not as the rest of their lives. Simão Rodrigues, writing much later at the end of his life, recalls the following about that day. After long discussion, then, they decided to give, he's writing in the third person, but he was there. After long discussion, then, they decided to give greater solidity to their determination that they would all bind themselves by a vow of poverty, of chastity, and of sailing to Jerusalem, and on their return, with God's help, of working with all their might for the salvation of their neighbor, faithful and infidel alike, of preaching the divine word to everyone, and finally of administering the holy sacraments of confession and the Eucharist without any stipend. Rodrigues not only agrees with Fabre about the brevity of the trip, that it's just a pilgrimage, but also emphasizes the kinds of work that they're going to be doing and that they're going to do it free of charge when they come back. As he goes on his account, he does explain that this was going to be done at the service of the Roman pontiff, so he doesn't disagree with Ignatius or Fabre in that regard. But what he also goes on to explain is that in his recollection, there was some disagreement about the trip to Jerusalem. Some people thought, well, we should stay in Jerusalem for the rest of our lives, do good there, maybe convert all the Muslims while we're there, what the heck? A little bit of flippant way of saying it, but that was the desire of some. And it's my flippancy, not Rodriguez's. But they couldn't agree on whether they were just going to make a pilgrimage there or whether they were going to spend the rest of their lives there. And so they decided they would cross that bridge when they got there. They decided when we get to Jerusalem, we'll reconvene and we'll decide what to do about whether we're going to stay or whether we're going to go back. That's the account that Rodrigues gives. Whose account is right? Well, we don't know. And I could give you a lot of historical argument and talk about where we should trust these and where we should not trust these, and we could get into all the historical things, but the reason I bring it up is for a point not about the history, but about the discernment. What's clear is that at the very least, all three of these people remembered what they had decided differently, which implies that at the very least, what was in their minds about what they were agreeing to at Montmartre was not all the same, and that is a very important lesson about discernment. Because discernment is not the same thing as making a plan. It's not a strategic planning session where we gather for communal discernment. Rather, in communal discernment, we are looking for the motions of God's Spirit and our own spirits, and trying to come to an understanding of where God is inviting us and where our own desires are. Communal discernment is not an exact process that comes up with an exact plan, because God is always leaving us in considerable freedom. God's will is that all be saved. God's will is not to manipulate us to doing an exact plan. God is inviting us much more openly and much more subtly in a way that respects our freedom. And so communal discernment is a messy business, and it's not always going to result in an exact plan. What discernment is leading us to is to noticing the motions of God, noticing where God is, where the invitation is, where our desires meet God's desire for salvation, our salvation and the salvation of the world. Communal discernment is about that level of discourse. And there's going to be disagreements about how to execute it. And that's going to happen throughout the entirety of the history of the society, and it still happens today. We don't always agree on our plans. What we're trying to come to is a resolution of the general direction to head in together. And that's what happened at Montmartre. They were formed as a group, not because they all thought the same way, but because they all detected the Spirit of God inviting them onward together, because their desires came together and they saw God's grace and consolation in that. And they saw that somehow through whatever path was going to happen, this was a way that they could help souls. This was a way that they could serve for God's greater glory. This was a way that they could respond to the love that they had known in the exercises by living out a life of service. That's our way of proceeding. It's not about making perfect plans. It's about listening to the invitation of God and proceeding forward accordingly. And that gets messy. And that's what we're going to look at in this course. We're going to look at how we discern in that messiness and what are the real pitfalls, not when our plans disagree, but when we ignore God's Spirit and when we don't listen to each other. And so we're going to look at all of that, the good and the bad, and see what we can discover about discernment in practice. Thank you.